In this lecture, we'll be discussing ecosystems. And the topics we'll cover is basically looking at ecological concepts, understanding how ecosystems are built and designed, and then we'll take a look at some examples of ecosystems, specifically looking at biomes, which are more or less terrestrial ecosystems or land-based ecosystems, and then also aquatic ecosystems, things that we'll find in freshwater systems and also in the ocean. Let's begin by reviewing an overview of ecology. So really, ecology can be defined as the branch of science that deals with the interrelationship between living things and their environment. So we talked about the importance of interrelationships and the interconnectedness of environmental science. And this is one of the big reasons why, is because life has a strong connection to the land. When we study ecology, we often observe it at different levels of organization. We, of course, can observe individuals, which would be the single member of a population. We can study also at the level of a population, which is a group of individuals that are part of the same species, that live in the same area at the same time. A community would be all the different populations that interact with one another. So in this example, we have some cockatiels would represent a population, but when we zoom in on that graphic, we can see not only are there cockatiels in this habitat, but we also see scarlet macaws and koalas and trees and many other things. So a community involves many different species. An ecosystem itself is a community that is interacting with the non-living component of the habitat. So it would include all the living things that are part of the community, but also the water, the land itself, the air. A biome would be ecosystems that tend to collect together within a certain range on our planet. And then the largest level that we would study ecology is the biosphere itself, which is the entire inhabitable portion of the Earth. Environmental factors can be defined as things that would impact ecosystems. We tend to divide them into two general sorts. We have abiotic factors, which would be non-living factors. So this could include things like energy, non-living matter, and any physical or chemical characteristics that are in an ecosystems. And then also biotic factors, which would be the living portions of the environment. Let's take a look at how that might be divided in this graphic. So we have an entire ecosystem that, of course, has a biotic component and an abiotic environment. Well, in the biotic environment, we can see there is a community, interacting populations, as we can see here. In this example, we have 4 different populations interacting. We've got our producer, which would be the fir tree, and then we have some insects and other consumers, such as the birds, decomposer, and the mushroom. So there's this biotic interaction. And so then within the population, you can see there's individual organisms. Now, all of those players in this ecosystem, all those living organisms in this population, have to deal with various physiological components to their environment. How much energy is available, and what is the climate like and the weather? Is there a lot of rain? Is there a little rain? What is the air quality like? What's the temperature like? The pH of the soil for the plants. So there's a number of things that they interact with as part of their non-living component of the environment. Now, when you consider these factors, we often see that organisms in ecosystems have a certain range of tolerance, or a degree to which they can withstand variation to those abiotic components, and this affects their distribution quite a bit. Often when we discuss range of tolerance, we look at what we call a tolerance curve, and you can see that here with this hypothetical population of fish. In this example, we are looking at the abundance of fish over different temperatures. With low temperatures, you can see being displayed on the left, and then high temperatures on the right. So there is clear along this range of temperature that there's a certain area where there's an abundance of fish, and so the population is very high. So when we look at that, when you see that there is an abundance of organism at a certain temperature in this case, but we could also do this with salinity, light availability, and other things. So that abundance of organisms is known as the optimum range. So we can see that here. Now, when we start to see the populations decline, we call that the zone of physiological stress. The reason we call it that is because now the temperature might be getting too low. We're getting out of the optimal range for the fish, for the species of fish, and so they're starting to be stressed. And there's only a few individuals that can tolerate that level of coldness in their habitat. And the same works for the other side. When it gets too warm, there are only a few organisms that can tolerate that degree of heat in their environment. So their population starts to decline for a couple of reasons. It could be that most of the fish have migrated out of that area to cooler water or more optimal water, or perhaps if there's no escape, maybe they're too stressed that they die off and their population declines that way. Now, when you have the area where there's no organisms, we simply call that the upper and lower limit of their tolerance. So basically, it's more than stress. We actually call that the zone of intolerance. They can't tolerate that. And later on in the course, we'll talk about how species become indicators to what's going on abiotically in the environment. When populations decline drastically, that's an indication or like a warning light that something is wrong with their habitat. And that could be as a result of natural causes, or it could be due to some pollutant in the water or something like that. A good example of how this works is seen here in North American reptiles. This is taking a look at the number of different species of snakes and lizards as we go from Texas up to Manitoba, Canada. And so you'll see in Texas, there is an abundance of both snakes and lizards. So they're pretty abundant. But as we move further north, as the environment changes, most notably due to temperature, and we get up to Manitoba, we see very few reptiles up there. We can also see when we compare snakes and lizards that it appears as if snakes have a greater tolerance of colder temperatures than lizards do. So we can see how that impacts. Now, how this works when we look at a changing climate, for example, as areas like Nebraska and the Dakotas and Manitoba start to warm up more as the climate shifts with longer summers and shorter winters, we may see an increase in reptiles as they're able to tolerate that change in temperature, so to their benefit. So the indicator cannot always be a disappearance of organisms. Sometimes it can actually be an increase of organisms that ordinarily weren't seen in a particular range. A niche, or sometimes pronounced niche, it can be really pronounced either way, is the role an organism plays in this ecosystem. So it's more or less like its occupation, its job. This can also include a summary of its resource requirements, what it needs, and its tolerance to various conditions. So we look at these wolves here, the gray wolf. It's most definitely a predator, right? And so it has resource requirements. It needs large prey to feed on, and it can tolerate cold winters. When we compare the niche of organisms, we generally see or commonly see two types. There's the generalist species, which thrive in a wide range of conditions. They can use a diverse resources. So like raccoons and rats and things like that, where you find them almost all over the planet. They're everywhere. They can thrive anywhere on the planet. Those are considered to be a generalist. Specialists are those that are adapted to a narrow set of conditions and can only rely on specific resources. So a good example of that would be like a panda bear. Only eats bamboo and is only found in a very specific range. The gray wolf we look here is actually a combination of the two. It is a specialist predator in a certain sense, but ordinarily it's a generalist because it can adapt fairly well, and it can eat elk, it can go after bison, it can whatever it needs to to survive. It's pretty adaptable, but they do have preferences. So we kind of say that a lot of species, it's like going from general, it's not that anything is a generalist or a specialist, although there definitely are some generalist species and specialist species, but there's also kind of a range or a spectrum. Now, a habitat then would be defined as where an organism can be found, a place where it lives, the setting. And so here on this map of North America, we can see the habitat and range of the wolves, and we generally see two populations of the gray wolf in North America. This over here in the Montana, Idaho, this is the kind of like the Yellowstone population that receives a lot of press, but there's also a population that's over in Wisconsin and Michigan, Northern Peninsula, Michigan, I should say. And these just happen to have the right conditions for these wolves to succeed. This is like their optimum range where prey and conditions are just right for them. We'll now switch gears. Now that we've kind of reviewed the basics of ecology, now we're going to take a look at different types of ecosystems, specifically focusing on biomes first. And again, biomes refers to a biome as a terrestrial community, terrestrial plant and animal community that covers a large geographic range. And you can see on this map, here are the different biomes that we're talking about, right? So we can see we've got starting from the top, we have basically biomes that are just strictly ice, and you may think, well, not much survives there. Well, yeah, there are organisms that are adapted for ice. Then we have the tundra, like in northern Canada and Russia, deserts, mountain ecosystems, boreal or pine-based forests. We have temperate forests like we see here along the east coast of the United States, grasslands like in the middle of North America, the prairies, right? We can see Mediterranean scrub, which is common along the Mediterranean Sea, and also California, areas that are very good for growing wine, and it just has the rights. So if you or your parents are into wine, you'll notice like California wines, and then there's like Chilean wines. We also have Spanish and Italian wines. There's South America, and there's also Australia. And that's really because it's a great zone for growing grapes. Like they get the Mediterranean scrub is an interesting biome where there's not a lot of rain, or at least there is enough rain to support the growth of grapes, but then there's a dry season where the grapes become very concentrated in their sugars, and it makes them great for fermenting into wine. So that's why why I bring that out, why that particular biome is good for that. So you may not be a wine drinker yet, but this explains why, if you go into Publix, even a grocery store, why they will separate the wines based on region, and here's why. It has to do with biomes. The tropical rainforest is one that gets a lot of press, so we see that exists. Your tropical biomes exist pretty close to the equator within the zone of the tropics, between 30 degrees north and south, right? We also have tropical seasonal forests, savannas, which are very famous in Africa, where we see elephants and such, and tropical scrubland as well. So basically, what we see, we can clearly see there's like a latitudinal distribution where you have a lot of tropical biomes such as rainforests along the equator, and then as we move further north you start to see grasslands and temperate forests with trees that have broad leaves that fall off during the autumn, and then there's like the vast pine forest in northern Canada and northern Russia, and then the tundra, and then the polar ice caps. So you can kind of see latitudinally how they distribute. And a lot of their distribution is solely based on two main abiotic factors: temperature and precipitation. So the degree to which they can withstand cold temperatures and the amount of rainfall that is in their area. And they tend to be identified by the predominant vegetation and the organisms that are adapted there. So notice I kind of did that. So we have tropical rainforests, which have broadleaf trees that do not lose their leaves. Then we have forests in the temperate zones that do lose their leaves during the wintertime. And then we have evergreen pine trees that are up here in the taiga or the coniferous forest. So they're identified by vegetation in a lot of times. And so when we look at this graphic here on this graphic, we have the x-axis is looking at precipitation, and the y-axis is looking at temperature. So these biomes tend to sort themselves out according to these two factors. So we can see When you have very little rain, you tend to have a desert, and you can have a hot desert like the Sahara or a cold desert. You can also have tundra when it gets very cold, and the tundra is famous for getting very little precipitation, and the fact that the subsoil in the tundra is frozen into what we call permafrost. And permafrost prevents the growth of trees, and there's also very little light in the tundra area, so you won't see many trees. You'll just see grasses and maybe some small shrubs. Whereas as you go to a cold desert and a warm desert, you'll see there's very little vegetation simply because there's not enough rain to support it, and the soil formation there is very poor. Now, when we increase the temperature a bit and we get into not increase the temperature, we increase the precipitation, meaning there's more water available. When it's very hot, we can have tropical dry forests, and also savannas become more common. Savanna is very common along the, we see savannas in Africa, right? So this yellow portion. So this is where you'll find these elaborate grasslands with lots of zebras and lions and such. Then you have temperate grasslands. When you have it gets a little colder. So temperate is usually a term that refers to seasonal, right? You'll have winter and a summer. So temperate grassland, and I apologize, the colors on these do not match up with the map, so just be aware of that as you're kind of making an analysis here. So temperate grassland, so we can see the temperate grassland here would be, basically we're looking at the prairies here, so right there, just grassland. So these are like in the middle of the United States where we have the plains. Lots of grass is growing, soil is very rich because of the Mississippi River system and so forth. During the summer there may be grass fires, brush fires, but there's also plenty of growth. There's also the temperate deciduous forest. Again, it's temperate because we have a range of temperatures and then also more precipitation. Northern coniferous forest as we get colder, right? So again, more precipitation will support more plants. So very little precipitation, very little plants. Moderate precipitation, we're starting to get into grasslands and some forests. Very wet ecosystems will supply enough rain for vast tropical rainforests and temperate rainforests like we see out here in the western coast of the United States. So again, they tend to be, there's kind of a couple of things here that as we increase precipitation, we can support larger vegetation like trees. And as we increase temperature, we tend to increase a diversity of plant life. So we can see this also played out, or a distribution of biomes can also be observed as we go along a couple of axes. As we increase the latitude, as we are close to the equator, we tend to see tropical rainforests, and then moving north or away from the equator, then we'll go and see temperate deciduous forests, and then the taiga, which is dominated by pine trees, then tundra, which has permafrost and very little vegetation, and then polar ice. But we also see this as we increase altitude and go up a mountain. So you could have an island or even a landmass with a tall mountain in the tropics have rainforests at the bottom, and then as you move up the mountain, you'll get into more of a deciduous forest. You'll hit what's called the pine line, where only pine trees can exist, and then a tundra, where maybe only lichens and a few herbs are growing on the rocks, and then finally the snow caps on top of the mountains, the ice pack. Now, biome distribution is dynamic, and what we mean by that is it changes. It's changed specifically since the last ice age. So during the last ice age, this is looking at 13,000 years ago, you can see a good portion of North America was covered with ice all the way down to the Great Lakes. And so the Great Lakes area was a lot of, you can see was tundra. We see Florida was a lot of scrubland, right? It was very different than it is now. And we go ahead and look today, well, now the ice has receded a bit. The Great Lakes are no longer ice, but they have pine forests and deciduous forests around them, and here we have forests in Florida now. So again, as the climate has shifted during the last ice age, and again, this is an important thing to note, that climate does change. It can change naturally and also be influenced by human factors as well. We'll get more into that as we develop this course. But we can see here, the biomes switch, they change as an indication of a changing climate. As the climate continues to shift through this century, we can expect the growing seasons where we grow crops to migrate northward, and this will be an interesting principle. So you can see that is expected by the end of this century that in Canada, a lot of Canada's ability to grow food will increase, and this is significant for that country because its ability to produce its own food and also export things will increase. So we might see a shift, and you can see it's expected that in the United States it's going to be harder to grow crops in certain regions because it's going to become more tropical, more subtropical, and those crops may not be able to tolerate the changes in temperature as the climate shifts. So one of the small effects of climate change that not too many people talk about or are aware about is that our ability to grow food here in the United States may be compromised a bit, and that may make us reliable on exports or imports from other countries and so forth. Now let's take a look at some aquatic ecosystems, and when we use the term aquatic, we're talking about anything that is waterborne or in the water. So we'll start with freshwater ecosystems, looking first at rivers, and they have three major zones: the source, transition, and floodplain. The source zone gets its name because this is where the rivers form. So you have the ice at the top of mountains. In the winter, the snowpack, it melts in the spring, and the rivers start to run down, and usually the rivers and the headwaters are fast flowing rivers with lots of waterfalls. The water tends to be very clear, or what we call oligotrophic, more on that in just a bit, and high oxygen content. So there's a lot of erosion that occurs here. So you can see the rivers will erode valleys in the rivers. And if it erodes the rock, well, then it's going to carry those sediments through the river all the way down into the transition zone. The transition zone is at lower elevation. This is where the rivers start to flow starts to slow down. The rivers start to get a bit bigger. And they have these broad valleys, and the rivers start to meander and slow down, and they start to deposit those sediments a little bit in this zone. You'll notice this encourages the growth of plants and forests along the riverbank. The flood zone is at the lowest of elevation. We're almost at sea level at this point, and really the river has slowed down. It's gotten much bigger, and or broader, I should say. It meanders quite a bit where you see these turns, and you start to see the formation of wetlands and a vast deposition of sediments as the river starts to enter and slow down and head towards the ocean, or perhaps a lake, a large lake if it's heading there. And these floodplains are very significant. They get their name floodplain because if there is a flooding event, this is what it tends to be affected here. So kind of saw that in Texas in recent years. But also you can see this is where you can grow a lot of crops because the sediments are deposited here in this area, and that enriches the soil. It's full of nutrients and minerals that are great for growing crops. When we look at ponds and lakes, we tend to observe there's distinct zones. So obviously this is a large standing body of water. So when we look at a lake or a pond, we can see there's the upper region is known as the photic zone, getting its name because there's plenty of light available. And then below that is the aphotic zone, where we start to see very little light. We also tend to have a littoral and a limnetic zone. Littoral zone is an area where you tend to see rooted plants, whereas the limnetic zone is like the middle of a pond. And you can see that even in the ponds around our school, retention ponds that are along highways and roadways, you'll see a lot of what we call emergent plants along the littoral or edge of the ponds. So the water is shallow enough where vegetation can take root and its shoots can exist above the water line. There's also a lot of submerged plants there too that do not break the surface. They're rooted into the shallow water, but they stay submerged below the water line. Notice when you get out into the limnetic zone, it's just too deep for plants to grow. And so the center of a pond tends to be free of any aquatic vegetation unless it can float on the surface. But even still, that prefers to collect along the edge of the ponds in the littoral zone. As with terrestrial biomes, ponds and lakes are very dynamic and change over time. So a younger lake tends to be oligotrophic. They are deep, cold, nutrient poor, meaning there's not a lot of nutrients. That helps to keep their waters very clear. Okay, so they're low in productivity as well. But as a lake ages, it can become more eutrophic. They tend to be shallower because they've filled in with sediments. And as a result, because they're shallower, there's more of a littoral zone where there's more plant life and there's more nutrients. The water tends to become more murky. So rather than be clear blue water, it starts to be kind of like a green color and a little bit darker in color as well. So, but this is natural. Although occasionally you will see that in ponds and lakes that are over or have too many nutrients. This is common along golf courses. Ponds will get too green, right? We call that cultural eutrophication. We'll talk about that in our water pollution unit. But basically, you can have too many nutrients that stimulate the growth of too many algae, and it can become almost too green and somewhat unnaturally fertilized. Marine ecosystems are those that are in the ocean. They have a high saltwater content, and the ocean can be divided up into these interesting zones. So of course, the limiting factors here, as we saw with ponds and lakes, are light, availability of light nutrients. That distinguishes the zones. So let's take a look at the different zones here. We have the pelagic zone, which is basically all the water portion of the ocean. Basically, if you're swimming in the ocean, you're in the pelagic zone. But you could be close to land over the continental shelf, and we call that the neritic zone, or out in the deep ocean, that's the oceanic zone. Now the oceanic zone, because it's beyond the continental shelf and far away from the continent, it has various layers. The epipelagic tends to be our photic zone, right? That's where we have plenty of light. Below that is the mesopelagic, then the bathypelagic, abyssopelagic, and the hadopelagic. If you're a Finding Nemo fan, those terms are probably familiar, as Mr. Ray would be singing those to his class. Now, we also have ecosystems that exist between the high and low tide, and we call those intertidal zones, right? They're right along the coast. We'll talk about some of those ecosystems in a bit. Benthic is a term that refers to anything along the bottom. So it wouldn't be swimming in the ocean, but it'd be along the bottom. So you could have subtidal, which extends all the way from the beach on out to the edge of the continental shelf. And then as you go deeper, you can have the bathal zone, abyssal, and hadal zone. They correspond to their the pelagic zones that have the same depth. So you can see what distinguishes these zones is whether or not there's light available and how many nutrients are available as well. Let's take a look at estuaries here. So estuaries are a unique coastal ecosystem where freshwater is flowing into the ocean, and you usually have an enclosed embayment. And so there's a great mixture of freshwater and saltwater, making it quite dynamic, plenty of nutrients, and life loves this. Life loves to exploit estuaries. There's an abundance of living things, an abundance of plants, but the challenge here is being able to deal with the salinity. That can be a limiting factor. So if the salinity or amount of salt content in the water is very high, well, that's going to limit this type of fish that'll be present there. But if it is brackish water, meaning a mixture of freshwater and saltwater, well, then that can introduce a number of different marine organisms that can tolerate that changing salinity. And here in St. Augustine, we have a lot of brackish species with the St. Johns River and the intercoastal with the fluctuating salinities. We'll see species like redfish and and other things that can handle the changing salinity. Coastal ecosystems such as estuaries and mangrove forests and such are influenced by latitude and tides. We say latitude because in the tropics we tend to see more mangrove trees, and then in the temperate zones, as we move away from the equator, you start to see more salt marshes. St. Augustine, the area that we live in, is an interesting zone because we have both mangrove forests and salt marshes along our coastlines. So we kind of exist in what we call an ecotone. This is an area that exists in between kind of two different ecosystems or biomes. So it's kind of interesting, and that increases our diversity quite a bit in our area. Coastal ecosystems tend to be connected, so we can see here this graphic is showing the interconnectedness of mangrove forests and salt marshes. And they have this connection to open channels and even the open ocean. In fact, many of the nutrients that are produced in salt marshes and mangroves will make it out into these embayments to support food chains. And the protective roots and vegetation of salt marshes and mangroves tend to be nursery habitats for juvenile fish that, once they get to a certain size, can then migrate out into the ocean. We also see that these dynamic ecosystems along the coast are very good at sequestering carbon dioxide. They love to pull carbon dioxide out of the ocean, so as we discuss the implications of climate change, which is a result of us putting too much carbon dioxide out into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels, well, these ecosystems along coastlines, mangroves, seagrasses, marsh grasses, all of them are very good carbon absorbers. They take more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So really that's part of the solution to our climate change issues, to protect these ecosystems along these very dynamic coastal and tidal influenced ecosystems. All right, let's finish up with just a little bit of practice here. So this is looking at a practice MCQ. So traveling southward from the Arctic regions of Canada to the tropics of Panama, one passes through several biomes: tundra, coniferous forest, temperate deciduous forest, and tropical rainforest. This pattern of change in vegetation is primarily the result of, primary and secondary succession, invasion of exotic species, an increase in the mean annual temperature, and a decrease in mean annual precipitation, mean referring to average? Or is it an increase in the average temperature and precipitation? Or is it simply an increase in total annual hours of sunlight? The correct answer here is D. So we're seeing both an increase as we go from the north to the south, from cold tundra to warm tropical rainforest. We see an increase in temperature, obviously, but also an increase in the amount of precipitation. Here's a practice FRQ that would align with this content. Environmental conditions in coastal estuaries vary hourly and seasonally. Part A. Discuss two important causes for the variation in the temperature and salinity of an estuary. Be sure to include the connection between each and temperature and salinity. So here's how this would be graded, and I apologize for it being a little bit small, but you might be able to zoom in there if you can. But basically one cause is the tides, right? So mixing of water. So notice here's the cause, and then here is the discussion, right, of how the tides connect to the change in salinity. But you could have gone with seasonal flow of freshwater from rivers, right? So basically as during the spring there's more runoff from land because of the snow melting, and so therefore that would affect it. You could talk about turbidity. We haven't really discussed that. Storms like hurricanes and so forth. So notice there's a number of options, and this isn't even all the options. So you don't have to, there's more than one correct answer. But also with this, notice it's asking you to discuss two of them. So you would have had to pick two to get the full credit for the question. Now part B is asking you to discuss two roles that coastal wetlands play that are ecologically important, and two roles that wetlands play that are economically important. Okay, so ecologically and economically important. Well, here's how that would be graded. Ecologically important roles could be the fact that they have a high productivity, they make lots of plants, and they're a carbon dioxide sink, meaning they hold that. And then here's the discussion of what they do. They have a lot of biodiversity. They're a nursery, I mentioned that, right? They're nesting sites for birds, and also they're filters for water quality. So there's some other ecologically important. I didn't get into the economically important. I apologize. I should have put that up here as well. But here you can see there's some other. But these, you could see these could be very well turned into economic rules, right? Reduction of flooding helps to lower insurance costs, etc. And even going into the high biodiversity or nurseries for fish, well, that provides fish for fishing, for recreational fishing, and for industrial fishing as well. Part C is to identify, explain 3 ways in which humans have had a negative impact or degraded coastal wetlands. So again, this is only part of the potential answers, but building or development. So basically, as we build housing developments and things along the coastline, well, this is the explanation. You can have industrial commercial enterprises releasing pollutants. Golf courses are mentioned here, right? That can lead to a lot of fertilization and other things. So and this is just 3 of them. There are a number that you could have picked to answer this one. In Part D, choose one of the negative human impacts you identified in Part C and explain one environmental policy and one economic incentive that could have prevented it. So basically, so if you went with water pollution, for example, in Part C, you could have talked about the Clean Water Act. Well, that helps to protect wetlands, etc. So you could have done that. We can have the Coastal Zone Management Act, right? This is basically helps to comply with coastal zone management so that we're developing appropriately. So that would help with that. If you went with humans are negatively impacting biodiversity, for example, you could have gone with the Endangered Species Act, and that's usually a piece of legislation that most people use or are familiar with. So notice in this example, in this question, D, you are responsible for knowing some of the laws, not all of them, but just I would make sure you're familiar with a few of them that understand, and we'll discuss these as we go along in the course. You'll become familiar with the Clean Water Act and the U.S. Safe Drinking Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. We'll discuss them, and so these are just kind of like little. You might want to have some basic knowledge of how these laws protect our ecosystems.